Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Covenant Cast, where we discuss the past, present, and future of the tabletop gaming industry. I'm Zach.
And I'm Steven, and we are finishing off the Power 7 series with an interview between Zach and I with each other. We feel like we've learned from 6 incredible interviews from a number of leading designers in the space, and so we're going to take the lessons that we've learned and approach the topic of free, in quotation marks, in a new and surely unique way. Stay tuned.
I don't know how surely unique this is going to be
Well, here's what I've learned. So this is the...
in all of your life. It all amounts to this.
It all came down to, we had and have grand ambitions of kind of getting the record built on these 7 concepts, these 7 things that happen in card games that can cause so many problems from balance, competitive balance specifically, which is another thing that we've really learned to hone in on the difference, competitive balance. And there's a couple of things I've learned throughout the process. One is that basically these 7 mechanics kind of encapsulate all things you can do. Like, there's not a lot left after these 7. And it turns out the reality is you can break a game in 1,000 different ways. Yeah. All sorts of mechanics can make it happen. And what these designers have been saying is effectively, as unsatisfying as it might be, well, it depends. It's totally subjective, right? Nothing is actually free. There is no free unit or concept. Or you got to pay some kind of a cost. And it all just comes down to the fact that whatever the cost was, or whatever the thing was that was balancing the recursion mechanic or the amount of board that you could have, all of that, if it's not balanced well enough, it's unbalanced. Does it really come down to that?
I think we're done. Yeah, I do think one of the more interesting notes from all the episodes for me was essentially most of these designers on most of these topics, which we'll go through them all again, I assume, at the end of this. It's essentially, these are tools that you can use that are riskier. It's like fire, right? It's an essential thing that we need to have most of the time for most of these tools. If you're not doing some of these things in some of these ways, and it really points to how nuanced and complex all these game systems can be to me, because there are a million ways to break things or to create issues or to box yourself in down the road. But most of the TLDR on the series is like, you can do all of these things. You just need to do them intentionally and with restriction / can be conservative.
Yeah.
With how much you're applying to it. And this particular topic of free is really, it's just as fundamental as no matter how your resources work in your game. Sometimes resources are actions. Sometimes they're cards out of hand. Sometimes they're literal resource tokens that get put on the table. But a lot of card games have cost of some kind. Again, it doesn't have to be like a printed, this costs 3 resource tokens or whatever. It could be, it costs your action. That is the fundamental cost. And then anytime your game is removing that cost, proceed with caution, right? Because if you're saying it costs an action point, Destiny had this problem
from the
front,
beginning,
right? It was like, the tension of the game is I take an action, you take an action. I take an action, you take an action. And immediately, I mean, it just can't help it, right? That core set Ray was a way to get multiple actions, the ambush keyword. It's like, well, this doesn't cost you an action. It skips that part of the cost. That game also had resource cost, but so many of the places where that game broke or because you were either skipping an action cost or skipping a literal cost. But to go back to the free reality, there's the action, and then in that game, there's the resource cost. And so if you print 3 resource cost onto a card, and then you give players a way to not pay that cost, like the way you are valuing it, of course, is that it should cost you 3 in-game units of whatever it is. So, of course, free could easily lead to problems, right? And we've seen that 100 times.
Yeah, I think the main crux of this particular discussion around free, I think what it comes down to for me is that the easiest way to understand costs is in a very technical way. Like whenever I have a cost curve of 0 to 8, let's say, like Game of Thrones was kind of in that space, 0 to 8, I can really kind of build a mathematical formula around what does 1 cost need to look like, what does 4 cost need to look like, what 8 cost need to look like. And some things are going to be like an 8.5 cost, but it only costs 8, or it's like 9, or let's say 4.5 in value, but it costs 4. And those are typically the higher end cards that you'll see in the competitive decks. But it's not terribly obscure what the value of 1 gold or 1 resource is. I think when you start trying to layer in other elements of game and ask what do those cost, it's a lot harder to have a mathematical calculation of like, what is an action worth? What is the ability to act 2 times in a row worth, right? Is that 4 costs worth of free? Is that 3 costs worth of 3? Is it 8 costs worth of 3?
Sometimes it's like nothing. Sometimes it's everything.
Yeah, and I think those are the things that have most commonly actually created issues, because you hear all the designers say, well, there is a cost. But how do you calculate the cost of like the increased cost that should exist whenever you're pulling a card from your discard pile, right? So like, let's say it's free for me to play a card from my discard pile. Yeah. It's turn 3, right? It's free for me to play a card. Well, so like, most designers might say by turn 3, like you don't have enough resources to have produced an expensive card that would then be in your discard pile. So like, that's probably only worth about 2 or 3 that you could get out of the discard pile there. So like, we'll value this card at 3 because that's its best use. And then that kind of works for a while. But then like, okay, then set 3, we release a card that discards cards at the top of your deck on turn 1. And now, oh my gosh, wait, now they can get 8 cost things in the discard pile. And now this card that used to be fine is suddenly producing way more value than when we printed it. And so cost curves, it's hard for those to spiral out of control because you can keep the lid on that always. But when you introduce free and then you introduce an additional cost that has a certain value when you print it, it's so easy for future cards to change the value of that over time.
Sure.
And so it's just kind of, that's where the subjective designer input has to live for these kinds of free effects. And I think how can you ever pin that down?
Well, and I think, it's important to frame this a little bit in terms of if every card, like Flesh and Blood is such a good example of this whole conversation to me, because, we say in our Fab Foundation series, like the average value of a card is 3. It does 3 damage, right? It can either block for 3 or it can attack for 3. That's the expected average value of a card. And one of the most fascinating parts of card games is, as a player, figuring out which cards can generate you more value routinely, right? Or in specific scenarios, and which combinations of cards actually generate the most value. Mm-hmm. Like that's one of the most appealing parts of like deck building. You have a concept and it's like, well, this card is usually worth 3, but if I have this on the table and this has happened and my opponent's doing this, it's worth 10, right? And you're trying to set up to create these scenarios and you have a strategy to get there and all that kind of stuff. But thinking through on the Flesh and Blood front, at least, the card that came to mind was Rattlebones, which you can pay 2, which is a card. You have to pay 2 resources and play a card. And to pay 2 resources in that game, you have to also pitch a card.
I know where you're going with this.
To then pick a card out of your discard pile that's an attack specifically that you can then play on your turn. Mm-hmm. There's some other instant weird stuff, value chain as well. But just the basic reality of, in terms of that's recursion. It's grabbing a card from discard pile. It's, free in that you're playing the card from the discard pile, technically. So it's not costing you a card, but to play the card that lets you play the card costs you 2 cards immediately. So then you also have to have, the resources to play that card again, right? Whatever you're getting, you have to pay for the Rattlebones for 2 and also the card you're getting. So it's really restrictive. It's also, other things as a designer and a player that you're having to parse out, because it's not so simple. In Fab, specifically, the Warrior class is the constant. It's just card for 3.
Yeah, it's the linear.
Everywhere, yeah.
It's the base equation, I would say.
Yeah. But like Rattlebones is a really good example of like, well, what's the value of this card? And it's like, well, hypothetically, it could have just been an attack. So then you don't have to pay 2. So what you're really getting is the choice of all the attacks in your discard pile to play the one that is the best right now. But at the same time, like you are having to pay for that privilege. So it's a really, like, what is the actual value of that? Sometimes it's just, it's actually not that good.
Yeah,
you played Rattlebones, you pitched a card, and then you're playing an attack, and it's doing 4.
Mm-hmm.
I was like, well, I mean, I spent a couple cards to do 4. That's really not that good. Sometimes Rattlebones is like bustedly good.
Yeah.
Right. You also have a downside of like, what if you don't have any attacks in your discard pile, like you were saying?
Yeah.
Then it's just a blank card.
Yeah,
That's
and then
even worse.
Then you got like variants trying to be a counterbalance to cost.
Yep.
Right. And that's where things get really weird.
That starts pivoting into the limit one of kind of conversations, which is, well, if it doesn't work all the time, how as a designer, it's really tough because we're talking about free, but not even free. How do you even value any given fundamental thing that's not just the simplest? Because it's rarely, it's rarely just this is an attack that does 3 and blocks for 3. Well, that should be a 0 cost card in Fab. Like according to the spreadsheet.
It's called Wounding Blow. It's actually a 4 damage card.
Yeah.
0, 4, 3.
0 for 4. Either attacks for 4 or blocks for 3. And you see that slant in a lot of games too. X-Wing does this with the dice. Where it's slightly favored to offense. Mm-hmm. That's how the game happens, right? If it was equal, then you would just play defense. That would be the obvious play, right? But both as a designer and a player, is a very long-winded way of getting to this point I'm about to make. I promise I'm going somewhere.
That's why we're here on the podcast, though, Zach.
Yeah,
that's what we like. We like the long-winded journey to the point.
The reality of that cost equation, right? And the thing I want to point to is the absurd difference in the gap between 0 and 1 and 1 and 2. So 0 is like if you multiply it by infinity, you never get to 1.
Yeah.
If you multiply 1 by 2, you get to 2. So 2 is twice as expensive as 1. 1 is infinitely more expensive proportionally to 0. Because a 0, almost no condition, you can always play it, right?
Yeah.
And in Fab, there are cards that cost 0, and some of those are very good. They're just so reliably good because they just don't cost anything, right? So, and that's true in all games. But then what we're talking about here too is when you introduce this ability to make cards that you have said cost, the thing about Skeleton and Fab and stuff, it's like, this should be a 10 cost card.
Sure.
And it's free. Now, some games, I picture Sorcery, that sort of freeness would be like a positively busted big moment in the game.
I'm glad you said big moment because I asked during the interview with Simon, what is it? He called it classic TCG fun. Like people were talking about as classic TCG fun. It's like, what does that even mean, right? And that was the answer from the comments after the video was like, I think Sorcery achieves that because it has a ton of big, insane moments that happen. Mm-hmm. Whereas the exchanges after the kind of tournament set in of Magic success became granular winning board advantage over 15 turns or 10 turns,
small
unless
trades,
you're red deck and all that. But small exchanges to choose a skill-based winner. Whereas the earlier CCG is a lot of it was like, here's some crazy things that can happen. Mm-hmm. If they happen too much, don't know if that's going to be a problem or not. But like, if your big things are happening and my big things are happening, it's big things.
It's the classic spoils of everything's busted, nothing's busted.
Yeah, it kind of just had that vibe. Yeah.
And again, the DNA of any given game is really important. But when you, particularly the most problematic version of this to me, this
freeness.
I honestly, if you have resources or costs in the game at all, action costs, resource costs, whatever, the most dangerous cards in my mind are the ones that cost 0.
Yeah.
Or that don't cost the action. Like that's even Ashes 1.0. It was all the reactions that create a problem, right? These kind of like, anyways, 0 cost stuff, watch out. The other one is any card that can make any other card not cost anything. Millennium Falcon and Destiny, Bloodsheath Skeleton, and Flesh and Blood. I've seen this over and over again, right? It's like, I'll play a creature from a discard pile for free. And it's like, well, wait a second. That's a 20 cost Sneaky Mansion. Or however much it was in spoils, right?
Yeah.
That's supposed to cost way more than this. And then I see you pulled up a fan favorite here that I'll let you, I want you to carry on about. But another just free implementation that's a little subtle and under the hood is when you don't put a cap on something. Skeleton did this, right? You could have had that chest equipment in Fab say minus up to 3, right? Or minus up to 2. Same with Millennium Falcon. It's like you can play a 0 cost event from your discard pile for free.
Yeah.
play a 1-cost event from
Yeah.
Discard Pile for free. So what's the example you have here? And I'm curious where you're going with.
Well, yeah. So I've got the Clavex War Leader pulled up, which is kind of the great dead horse of all of our conversations around game design. And what I think is important to the free conversation is understanding where it's so easy for it to go wrong when it could so easily go right.
Mm-hmm.
So like, what are some simple, as our friend Brendan, of course, would say, heuristics? Okay, so let's talk about the Clavex War Leader. This is essentially for anybody.
Conquest LCG.
Yeah, Conquest LCG. It doesn't really matter that you know the game, but it's a unit that comes into play, and it just basically says, after it comes into play, destroy a unit. And there's some conditions attached, et cetera, but it's just that simple sentence of destroy a unit. No matter what comes after that, it's kind of immaterial. But what that does this is a game based on damage and health.
Can't you play this guy at like instant speed?
Yeah, he's an ambush.
Yeah.
Of course you can. But the main problem here is, to me, that could have easily said deal 5 damage to a unit.
Mm-hmm.
Or it could say deal 8 damage to a unit, or deal 6 damage. Like, it always seems to be, the problem seems to be not playing within the rules that, again, are within the algorithms that you're setting up, right?
So he's not free.
He's not free.
But he can be played in instant speed.
Sure.
And there is no restriction. It's kind of it's not really a free thing as much as it's a limitless thing.
Limitless, yeah. So basically it's like, it's a removal that you don't have to really pay the cost of, because the thing that you're removing has a spread of points based on its cost. And if you have a unit that is costed at 3 cost because it has 10 health and 0 attack, Clavex War Leader suddenly is saying, like, the way that unit was valued doesn't matter anymore to this unit. And so I think one easy way to stay within the bounds here is don't use words like destroy something, carte blanche, or like you said, reduce something, carte blanche. Make
you can
sure
always
that
print a limit.
always have numbers there, right? So if damage is the way that units are removed in your game, make removal things do damage. It's pretty simple. Ashes is really good about this.
Yeah, well, especially Reborn.
Mm-hmm. Like even Fester, for instance, says, I think, destroy a damaged unit. And it's like, it could say deal 8 damage to a damaged unit, right? So I think those are easy. That's one easy example of how it doesn't mean that you don't have an effect that you want in the game. It just means that you keep it within the rule set and the kind of the numbers that you've built around, so that everything stays in the same world. Right?
Let me throw a devil's advocate at you for a
Yeah,
second.
hit me.
Because again, I think it's all also very dependent on the context, the game itself. So Conquest, that
something we've learned from all of these interviews, right?
Yeah.
It's like, well, what's your game supposed to feel like?
Yeah. Because I'm looking at this Clavex War Leader, and this is a game where you pay resources to play units. Those units have onboard value. They have attack and defense. I think it looks like, from what I can see, is a 4-cost unit with the stat lines of what you'd expect a 2 or 3-cost unit to cost.
It's about a 3-cost unit stat line with ambush.
But
it's 3 or 4. Yeah.
He's got ambush, right? So again, how do you value immediate speed?
How do you, right?
In that game is worth a lot.
Yeah.
Knowing how that game works, I know that not having to choose where to invest my resources until the middle of a battle is like premium.
Yeah. Tremendous.
So then you also slap in there a unlimited amount of, not only is this unit entering the field, surprisingly, at a moment of my choosing.
Which again is free, right? So you're skipping the action cost of playing this.
Skipping that, totally. And you're skipping the risk of and the information of telling your opponent what's going on, right? That's all very relevant to that game system.
And to our earlier point, so how as a designer, you have to think, how do you value that? Yeah. And it's different values based on set 8 or set 1.
And then on top of that, it's a removal effect at instant speed.
Yeah.
That does not have a restriction on the cost, right? So you can, if you play Conquest for one game, you would understand why this thing is just totally busted.
Yeah.
Like looking at it as it is now, if I were designing this game, that's an 8-cost unit.
Yeah, right.
And that's because you start, I think, with 7 resources. It's like you cannot be allowed to play this off of a single turn.
Yeah.
Right? Or whatever. I think it may be 5 resources. Yeah, it's just like, it's that good.
Yeah.
I think it's at 8, it probably still gets played.
Yeah, probably.
It's that powerful, but it was half of that. So the context, though, for me, I want to pivot to a very different game, Soulforge Fusion, we've been playing recently. So it has a fair number of these destroy effects.
Yeah.
But one of the interesting things, and I'll just frame it as a question. I have my own thoughts immediately on it, but Do you think that the inclusion of unlimited destroy effects in Soulforge is different? I know the context of that game is very different, so I'd be curious to know your take on that.
I think it's totally different, right? Because the cards are valued around one thing, and it's the cost of the card to play it. So everything that you play
and the cost being playing a card.
Playing a card. Because
there's no resource cost.
You don't have resources, you don't have gold, you don't have lands, you don't generate money. There is nothing. You simply have, it's like Keyforge, right? You have 5 cards, you play 2. So technically in Soulforge Fusion, every single card that hits the table should be equally balanced and effective.
Yeah.
Because it's one cost. You can say it has a cost. All of them have a cost of 1 card.
Yeah.
And so being able to have a unit that says destroy one of your opponent's cards by playing a card of yours is like, okay, that seems like that's
a card
an
for
accurate
a card.
trade.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
That can't get too out of whack.
Yeah. Now, cards that trade for cards but don't lose themselves are very powerful in that game, right? But that's where, and I would have to look with a close lens. I don't know that there's a lot of unit comes into play, destroys any other unit, and also just stays on the table.
Yeah.
I think every one of the just straight up destroy a unit that's the only thing it's doing.
Yeah, and I've also seen, I think I like what they do where it's like your opponent chooses destroy a unit or they take direct damage.
Yeah.
Right? It's like, okay, yeah, that's fine.
And that reminds me a lot of the changes we saw in Ashes Reborn, where they're actually increasing choice and making it more centered on what they want, which is the actual fight in the middle of the table.
Yeah.
But I immediately thought of Soulforge because it was, there's big destruction effects. But I think to your point, the other piece is the more you understand the nucleus of your design and the more you rely on that being the condition to achieve any card effect, like this war leader here, it would be one thing even if his ability was like the first time he does damage to something in a round, it's destroyed.
Sure.
So that he still has to come into play and he still has to do damage.
Yeah.
And when he does do damage, it's like really powerful and he can like surprise you after everything's exhausted on a planet. He pops in and punches something. But then you're playing to the key of the game. I think one of the most dramatic parts is that you could have shields in hand.
Yeah.
So if you can cancel the damage or if you can react and just stop him or exhaust him or blow him up, you have interplay instead of just it comes in, you've been dunked on. Thanks for playing the game.
Yeah, I mean, and isn't that really what it comes down to in so many of these free effects are effectively this. It comes in, you get dunked on, the end. Like a lot of times because free tends to skirt around playing the normal game, it cheats in some way, right? Things aren't free unless there's some amount of cheating going on. So because it's cheating in some way, a lot of times it's cheating in favor of the, skipping the traditional interaction that creates the tension of the game. And that tension might be, I know you only have 4 resources. I know you can only do so many things with 4 resources. And suddenly one of those resources turns into a 5-cost unit. We don't have the tension anymore. You Yahtzeed it.
Yeah.
Congratulations. You found the thing and the 2 cards lined up. Aren't we proud of you?
Well, and I think that's where you get into, which has upsides and downsides. That's where you get into knowledge of specific interactions being valuable and not a fundamental understanding of the functioning of the game being valuable. Where if you can imagine being a newer player to a game, you see what a 3-cost card looks like in your hand and you know your opponent has 3 resources. That would let you intuitively understand the kind of threat that they pose or could pose with the resources they have. And then they do something insane. And it's like, I played a 22-cost unit off of those 3 somehow.
Yeah.
And two sides of that, right? That's why I said ups and downsides, is that it's very unintuitive.
Yeah.
Just from a straight
My
plane.
2 resources can only get me this. Your 2 got you that. Like, how did that work?
And that can feel bad. It can also feel awesome.
Yeah.
Like when I hit a Sonata and Fab for 10 cards, it's like, it does feel cool.
Because that's the other thing. What if the cost of you getting to the point where your 2 resources turned into that was 6 turns of you putting things on the board that did nothing? And then suddenly you exodiate it, right?
Yeah, which is kind of how the rune chance worked. I always made that case. Like, you don't remember the weaker turns beforehand when I was doing half as much damage as everyone else while I'm building up to this thing, but you remember the turn where I went crazy.
Yeah.
And, you were talking about the value exchange and the grind of like little incremental exchanges earlier. It depends on your game and the style of play you want to allow. But I know some people really love combo. And it's like dirtling around and it doesn't seem like I'm doing anything. And then all of a sudden, actually, I'm like a god. And like, you can't stop me.
And see, that's where, in combo decks and free stuff like go together forever.
Always. And recursion and
Yeah, yeah, this is
and card draw and tutoring.
I wonder why I don't like combo decks. It ultimately comes down to this as you're relying on more and more cards to enter the equation. So if you just think about this like a math equation, right? It's like if I have one card that costs this much, I have a general idea of how much I can put into that card. So I put that on the table. But then if it's like this card is a little worse, but if this other a little worse card is on the table with this a little worse card, they both get a lot better. And it's like, okay, I can start to tweak some levers and say, like, okay, that interaction when it happens is good, but it takes 2 turns to get there of bad. So like the cost is paid, you know?
Mm-hmm.
But by the time you get to the 3rd card or the 4th card or the 5th card, and you're saying, okay, now what is the cost of them needing 5 cards to achieve this effect? And it's like, the 3rd, I don't know, is the 3rd twice as important? Is it, is it now worth 3, 2, 1, 5? Is the 4th card now because it's so far out and unlikely? Actually, I'm going to undercost that one because technically it's not good until these 4 things have happened.
Mm-hmm.
So as you continue to add additional costs to whatever you think is a fair effect, it just gets harder and harder to actually figure out the right amount of cost to have in these things.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting because all this comes down to how do you value a card, which is important as a player and designer. Because I even think about going a little bit back to Fab here. It feels like a lot of times the cards that are super valuable in that 3rd and 4th slot are undercosted.
Yeah.
Because there's a hidden cost to those cards, which means that you didn't block on your opponent's turn, which inevitably means unless they're doing nothing.
Right.
It penalizes them for doing nothing. But if they are doing something, you inevitably had to be taking damage in order to be able to play that card. So if it wasn't worth more, you would never want to use the 3rd or 4th card.
Yeah.
And some people would love Fab that way. It's like block with a couple cards, attack with a couple cards.
Sealed,
yeah.
baby.
And even in Seal, like when the stars align, it feels less bad, right?
Yeah.
Because it is kind of, that's where I get back like sorcery. And it's like, yeah, when you get to 7 resources and you hit that big 7-drop dragon and like it goes crazy on the board, that happens sometimes.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the expectation. And I think all of these things, no matter if they're abused or not, expectations are like 99% of it.
It really is.
Because if you go in expecting that to be possible, if you can set that expectation, this is normal, it doesn't feel bad, right? It doesn't create that negative experience. But from a designer perspective, right? This is just from the player lens, but from a designer, the costing of cards, free isn't critical to that, but the costing of cards is so challenging, especially the more nuanced your game is, if it has these kind of indirect costs going on, that make it, in Destiny, what's the value of an action? And again, sometimes it's not that much, but sometimes it's a world of difference.
And you also have to ask, what's the value of 2 actions in a row? What's the value of 3 actions in a row? What's the value of 4 actions in a row? And on we go, right? And is that compounding upward or compounding downward? Yeah. These are great questions. And so to even approach the topic of, where does free go wrong? You have to, as you said, understand how to cost a card. But we're already at the point where without free or anything being in the equation, figuring out what a card costs is already very difficult.
Yeah.
So whenever in your fundamental system, costing a card is difficult, and then you're saying, now what's the cost of an intangible piece of this, like time or, like combo potential or these kinds of things, it's very easy to just not know the answer.
Yeah.
I mean, you have to take effectively a sophisticated guess and a lot of testing and hope that whoever is testing these cards is smart enough to break them like your player base would.
Well, and I think this actually leads to a really critical part of this, which is why it's such an important conversation. I think the biggest thing with free, or even like the Clivex War Leader, where it's kind of this unlimited potential. If you pay 10 for a big old conquest unit, Clivex War Leader comes in and destroys it, and they get the instant speed unit that's already worth 4.
Yeah,
and also they remove 10 in value from your turn.
See, and that sunk in for me when you said that. I consider that free, the destruction, because you would expect a removal card to cost. Let's say if it removes a 10 cost, you'd expect it to at least cost like 8, 9,
should
10,
be 10, right?
11, 12, depending on when you can play it, how you can play it. But you should be getting 8, 9, 10 value you'd have to pay to get something of that cost off of their board, and suddenly you're paying 4. And so it's like, well, there's no cost to this removal effect, really.
Yeah. Yeah, because in that game too, right, the primary means for removal is attacking the unit.
Mm-hmm.
And so getting to just remove a unit like that for free is like so cheap compared. The fact that you also then just have this unit, it's not even like this unit destroys itself, you know?
The more I look at it, it's just like, what is going on? Like, it's a 4-3-3 ambush with 2 control icons is already on curve.
That's what I'm saying.
It's so good already.
Like you could remove the last paragraph and it would still be on curve.
It's so
insane. So the reason I sell this though is where it really goes wrong though is sometimes you can cost a card like this in design and when it releases, on point.
Yeah.
It's actually totally fair and balanced. Great card, right? But the thing I would just hammer over and over again is if you're printing cards that are going to be around forever or for an extended period of time, you do yourself a favor by not ever having unlimited potential. So if something's reducing cost, up to X.
Yep.
If something's destroying something, have it do damage or have up to X
yeah.
or have it, you know, even in this example, it comes into play and it's like destroy one of your units of X cost, destroy one of your opponent's units of X cost. So like maybe I already attacked with my 10 cost unit.
Yeah.
And then I bring this guy in. I blow my 10 cost guy up. I blow your 10 cost guy up that hasn't attacked yet. But it still cost me a 10 cost guy, right? Maybe my 10 cost guy also only has 1 health left. There's ways to make it like the timing of it and the sequencing in my favor. But the less you have these open-ended, upsides, the more it's this, creativity is born of restriction.
Mm-hmm.
So like you just prevent so many headaches if you are willing to restrict things. Even I picture that Clivex unit and like, can you list the cost of a unit it can destroy that covers 90% of units that could be in play?
Yeah. Or just like during testing, what is the maximum value you are accepting that this can do?
Yeah.
So like with the card pool as it is now, destroying we only have 4 cost units in the game, and that's like really good. So just say 4, and then that means that when you print your 7 cost units 2 years from now, because you always will, you don't have an immediate silver bullet to anything that's over a cost of 4.
Yeah. And I think, I'm thinking of just all of the examples. Millennium Falcon from Destiny keeps coming to my brain.
Any Falcon probably has.
Yeah. And that one's wild because once the Falcon's in play, you just get to keep rolling the dice in every turn.
Yeah, right.
Turn after turn. So there's no cost to it. So you could technically keep recurring whatever event over and over and over, which is recursion and free.
Yeah. These things often go together, don't they?
It's amazing how big of a sin that card is. It's like, and I've been warning Star Wars designers for years. It's always the Falcon. It's always the problem.
You'll always love it. Now, one thing else that I've learned in a lot of these conversations on the design front is that there's also a counter pressure from just simply a publishing hype standpoint, that you want some things to come through that are like noteworthy.
Mm-hmm.
Like you don't, it's funny, talking about Nisei, like the follow-up, the fan committee that's doing Netrunner, continuing kind of Android Netrunner, now their own Nisei Netrunner thing. I've had a lot of conversations with old Netrunner players about Nisei. A lot of people love Nisei. They love that it's going and it's being done very professionally. And then some of the feedback, at least on the early stuff, was like, I mean, it is Netrunner, but it feels grindier.
Yeah.
It's like perfectly mathematically balanced. So you change Stim Hack, which was like too good, a little bit too good, but it did brain damage. Just something that doesn't do brain damage and that's like the same kind of effect, but like more controlled.
Yeah.
And so there's also a player base, consideration of like, you need exciting big things to hit with these sets to get people interested, to be like, oh, what is Gandalf doing? Like, that's crazy what Gandalf does. And a lot of times it is crazy. Like it's too crazy for the fundamental turn-by-turn balance of the game, but it gets players' attention. And I know that Lucas had talked to us about that in the past of like, well, we opted to just go probably too high. Like there was a lot of ways to do this card.
Mm-hmm.
We opted for the biggest way because we figured people would be really excited about it. And if it was really broken, we could like fix it later.
Yeah. And if it's the Falcon, it's an iconic ship. I get it. You want it to be good. Same with Vader. I mean,
look at Hulk from Marvel Champions, for goodness sakes.
Yeah.
Right? Like we went very conservative because Hulk was maybe too good. And then suddenly you release a hero that everyone's like, we really like the hero, but like it's not good in this game.
Yeah. And interestingly, like on the cooperative front, it's funny to me, if anywhere to rein it in, that's not it.
Mm-hmm.
Because like, oh yeah, Doctor Strange is really good. so good. We just don't even play them.
Yeah, right.
But for someone that loves Doctor Strange and wants to play Doctor Strange, he's good.
Yeah.
And like you can make his deck as weird as you want, and maybe it's not as crazy good. It's just putting all the best cards in. But in a cooperative game, I feel like there's actually even more bandwidth to go a little crazier.
Yeah, to like always err on exciting over like boring.
Yeah, because I mean, you can always create situations and scenarios that are harder. But it's hard to go back and make a hero playable that you just whiffed on.
Yeah, you'd have to get the hero pack reprint.
And you see that all the time. Like if whatever your deck isn't good enough, you can complain about all the other cards that are too good. But there's always got to be a best card, and a best hero, and a best faction, and a best. There just is. So I think the most interesting thing you can do, though, beyond just creating busted effects in your game, is just ensuring that you're continuing to release things in all directions. Where A might be best, but technically, if everyone starts playing B and C, it's not as good anymore.
Mm-hmm.
But the moment people stop playing B and C, it's good, and you have this kind of like rotation. Not rotation, this self-guiding meta, right?
Yeah.
That's happening.
Yeah.
But I still think you can create interesting, powerful effects that are conditional and limited, that are exciting, that don't necessarily either have to just have an unlimited potential. Maybe right now it can destroy any unit in the game.
Yeah.
It does 10 damage to anything that comes into play.
Because we haven't seen a 15 damage unit yet, right?
Yeah. But if you can print a restriction, it just gives you so much more room to play with it later, to allow interplay, to allow other players to be able to stop it, to prevent the damage, to prevent the effect, to all that kind of stuff. And it all kind of ties together, because even thinking through the context of this free, so much of that's dependent on where's the core tension of your game and what's the experience you're trying to offer these players.
Yeah.
And like I could imagine a game where, like Soulforge, you just constantly have these giant, big free effects. And that might be the game. So free might not be a problem there. But if you have a resource curve, if you have a cost to playing things, both the cost to put them in and then the cost to prevent/remove them on your opponent's side is a critical piece to get right.
Yeah. I'm glad you mentioned Soulforge, because it's one of the wait and see for me. Same thing with Keyforge, right? Whenever your almost sole cost is an action and a card, the moment that you have something in which they have the free effect in the game, literally called free, it doesn't cost you your action, and it doesn't really cost you a card because you have others to play, right? Like you've doubled what the one card, one action could have done, and now it's 2 cards and 2 actions. Yeah. And so how you balance that, like how do you balance that without free actively hurting the player who's playing it? Because you're just getting extra cards. So I'm curious to see how that one plays, of like, oh wow, free is like so powerful in that game.
Yeah.
And it's like they have to balance that now by the second level and third level of that card being worse. And then now your late game cards are actually lower power, so that even getting free versions of them not as good.
And they have a lot of levers to do that. It reminds me of the early Destiny conversations about ambush and action point gaining and stuff, which is, essentially if it truly was one thing, there is a certain amount of spice that can be missing. Yeah. Because if you know your opponent can never do that, and that's where we come back to just using it in moderation, which is, I think even in Destiny, like the keyword ambush, almost never the problem. Like being able to play a weapon, the immediately activate a character, it's kind of cool, right? They're drawing their gun or their lightsaber or whatever. Being able to stack up effects to gain actions to do whatever you want is a different problem.
Yeah.
Right? And that's where you see Rey, when she gets a thing attached to you, gain an action. So you attach an ambush thing. Not only is the weapon free, but now you've actually got 2 things you can do. So now you can activate and shoot. Yeah. Which is just like crazy in that game.
And that's where, whenever you think about those effects, like if ambush had instead been, after this action you can attack, or you can activate a character, or so you can activate the character this was attached to. It's like, okay, how do we want this to work? Like we want this to feel like somebody drawing a blaster or drawing a lightsaber. So the only thing they can do after this is attack. They can't draw their lightsaber and then go, talk to this Wookiee over here and then go to this planet and then attack.
They can draw their lightsaber and then swing.
Yeah.
And you now have the moment to react before the swing comes through because you saw them draw the lightsaber, right?
Yeah.
Comparatively, though, for Flesh and Blood, right? Because of the way the turns work, it's kind of like I send a volley, you send a volley situation, and how much you block on my turn determines how much you can send back, vice versa.
Mm-hmm.
So action point gaining there it's not nearly as detrimental or bad because whatever action point you're gaining and whatever you're doing in your turn is always restricted by the cards in hand.
Yeah, and that's why card draw is so important in that game.
And also, the expectation is you're going to do everything you can with the cards that you've got. And then that's a phase, right? That happens, all that happens, and then it goes back over to me.
Yeah.
And on and on it goes throughout the game. Whereas Destiny is crazy, that ability to instantaneously do that. Because the core tension of that game, right? It's just understanding the core tension. The core tension of Destiny is you do one thing. A lot of times dice are sitting on the table that show me what you can do. And I get to make a choice.
Yeah.
What am I doing? Am I preventing what you're doing? Am I doing my own thing and threatening and back and forth? Whereas Flesh and Blood's tension is what all can they do with the hand of cards that they've got?
Mm-hmm.
So no matter what that ends up being, right? If you can gain action points and you can do all this crazy stuff, that's more fine there. But yeah, it is the context of how the system works and how the game wants you to play and where the tension comes from is so crucial.
Yeah, it's super important. I think we've heard a lot of people on the series talk about the core tension or the core, like where is your game?
Mm-hmm.
And that's just a good thing to have in mind, to think about. And we know the games that have those core principles really well defined typically are the ones that we're gravitating towards.
Yeah.
Like, oh, they know what this is about. So let's wrap it up like we did all the others. So we've got free. Final thoughts on free. Give me your final thesis.
Honestly, to me, just understand the core cost of your game, core cost of anything in your game, and I would hesitate to make anything free.
Final thoughts on free. Nailed it.
I would hesitate to make anything free, including in Flesh and Blood, right? I don't know that the game's worse if there are no zero cost cards in that game.
Yeah, true.
Like, it's different. You always have to have 2 cards to do something, but I think that a lot of the problems in that game are going to come from things that have this big old 0 in the top right corner.
Yeah.
And they have been, right?
Yeah.
Or they reduce something infinitely, or they scale infinitely, or whatever it is. So, like every other mechanic, I think the biggest piece here for me is just moderation. And the better you understand the cost, that's why we love Fab. The better you understand the cost curve of your game and how cost and all that's paid and all the indirect costs. What's the value of a card? What's the value of an action? What's the value of all that kind of stuff? The easier it is going to be to get this one right, but then also understanding what it means for something to be free, because it's not just 0 cost. An action has no cost associated. It's just an action, but you have to understand what the value of an action is to appropriately cost and restrict all of your cards.
Yeah, and my follow-up to that on approaching free is that the value of the intangible things that you're trying to use as replacement costs vary wildly over time and in specific pockets of cards. So like the value of playing one card after another in this faction might be way higher than it is in this faction. And so trying to center your card designs around free cost must be paid by X cost in this other unit. It's other, whether it's actions, which we see, or life loss, like I take 5 damage to play something for free. Mm-hmm. That all of that context may be right at the moment you're designing the card, but you have to think past that and say, like, there's a world where I have 2 years of cards developed past this, and so I'm going to restrict this card now based on what it's doing in the current metagame, in the current card pool, so that I always just have a lid on it. So my future designs aren't restricted by this idea that it's free from this effect. Therefore, I can't print anything that's too good if it's free based on this effect. So that it's just like, understand the context of the moment whenever you're designing cards. And like you said, restrict.
Yeah.
Restrict as much as you can. And I would say play within the fundamental units of your game. If it's about damage, then do damage to stuff. Don't just say remove it. If it's about cost, then have them reduced X costs, not just free. Right? Mm-hmm. Like there's a million different ways to think about that. And it's just like, just play within the base system you've already designed. Easy enough. So lightning round for us, Zach.
Yep.
I'm going to take the tour. Let's start with recursion. Final thoughts.
Man, recursion's bad. I agree with a lot of what the designers were saying. I think very limited. I think that when you do recurse something, it going away permanently is like the classic restriction.
As a rule.
Yeah. It fixes the Falcon problem. It fixes any recursion problems in Fab that I've seen, which most of them have that. It's banished and it can't be played again. And also having, like in Fab, there's a keyword banish when any card that is probably should never be recurred. It just immediately goes away when you play it the first time.
Yeah.
And you can, but that's just restrictions, right?
Yeah.
And understanding what would be something that would be really oppressive if it ever kept coming back. If it auto gets rid of itself before it comes back, then you've already fixed the problem before it is a problem. So all that to say, it is fun to have that option to play things, from the dead pile or from the discard pile.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes factions are thematically that. But that is, be careful.
Yeah, be super careful. I think just as a rule, banish or remove from game after a recursion effect happens should be where you start. And then see if we don't like this because we can't do it over and over. Then it's like a game like Ashes, you can have that assessment and say we should be able to recur these allies over and over again for the cost of a health. It's like, we're going to build that into the fundamental system. But if you're just kind of introducing cards and saying this is a recursion card because recursion's in games, look at the banish pile and the remove from game. And for the love of everything, do not let remove from game cards re-enter the game because I've seen that before.
That's horrible.
It doesn't exist in the game. How can we put it back in?
Yeah,
but I digress.
May as well be going to the binder.
Yeah, totally right. Let's talk about memory, infinite board states, floating information, those kinds of things. I will say my take on this is, I think that for the vast majority of players, we could actually have a scientific conclusion based on, scientific method, have a hypothesis, test it, try to disprove it, that there is a certain amount of information should exist on the board at a maximum at any given time. What that amount is, I don't know. And I think there are some, as we heard from designers along the way, there are some people that love trying to work through 7,000 interactions that can happen on the board. And there are some people that play board games that love that too. It's look at every single thing on this massive board. I can trade this thing for that thing. I can move over here and get this card and put that in, and that gets me 2 gold, and this goes over here. And there is a niche for that. But I think for the vast majority of people, there is an upper limit to that information, and we can probably find it.
Yeah. I mean, my tolerance is very low.
Yeah.
I have to be really, really into something, Middle Earth CCG, Star Wars CCG, to put up with that. Mm-hmm. But it's a very different kind of experience. And I think for card games in particular, the more memory you're asking players to use, the less appealing it's going to be for most card players. I think, it's a card game. You're playing out of hand. So having to know what's in your hand and how to use those cards is probably one of the more interesting focal points of a card game could be. But at the same time, if I were to put ratios to it, I want 95% of my effort to be strategic and tactical, and 5% or less to be, did I remember that location you put over there and what it does? Yeah.
Analyzation. Yeah.
Yeah. So personally, and I think it's personal preference, I know some people that just executing the mechanics of a game would be a very enjoyable experience. And it all comes back to those first principles, man. Mm-hmm. Where is the game? And if the game is in the execution, I even think about the Middle Earth CCG, half of the fun to me is that I have locations on a map that I'm moving around and I'm getting to see these beautiful locations and this beautiful art. But even that, as nuanced as that game is, they didn't put the complexity points on the cards. A lot of the heroes, it's are blank.
Yeah.
So they have a stat line. That's what makes Boromir. It's actually weirdly simple in that way. But the rules themselves are just remembering how to navigate through a turn is half the battle in that game.
Yeah, it really is. That memory can go a bunch of different places. I would say that my sole advice, even having heard all the different arguments for and against, etc., on memory and board states and stuff, is here's a simple heuristic. If you feel like your game requires board wipes to exist, like Valor Morghulis or Keyforge, like I gotta have big things in that remove everyone from the board so that it doesn't get too big, you probably should rethink
what's going
how
on.
that's working.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I just had a thought, and then I got lost in your follow up there.
I was gonna say it's relevant because like Valor is so Game of Thrones. Like it, in so many ways, it makes all the sense. But then, kind of at a certain point, it's make it a core mechanic of the game. Then,
yeah, I think one of my favorite examples of making sure this doesn't happen is Ashes.
yeah.
So it's just about restrictions. So every character in that game has a. This is how many creatures can be on the
And
table.
that's another lever that you
This
can
is how many
design
spells
with,
can be on the table.
Mm-hmm.
So there, you can have a lot going on in Ashes, and it's one of the deepest games we play on a routine basis in terms of the sequencing and the nuance of what can happen in a single turn. It's incredible, but there's restrictions. It could be you could have as many creatures as you wanted, but then there are board states in Ashes that could get to the point where I'm uninterested in solving the equation anymore. It actually becomes less it gets so complicated that it may as well be nothing on the table for me. So that's I think that's heavy preference though. I know some people like those really chunky board states.
Some people do.
I just don't think it's a lot of people.
Some people do. That's right. Moving on to denial, cancels, prevention, etc.
Man,
did you move the needle move at all on any of this stuff for you, or haven't talked about it in a professional capacity?
I think the needle on this has changed over time for me. I used to be a total degenerate. Like I picture my burn decks in Game of Thrones. And part of my appeal in hyper control there was keeping the minimal board states. Like I like the smaller, grindier exchanges. Obviously, you have the surprise element of killing stuff instantaneously with your burn effects or whatever, which is
dragons,
fun. Yeah, etc. But I think personally, I like a touch of control where you can't ever 100% count on what you're doing happening, but also it's still going to happen most of the time. Because, classic blue player, I think is what they would call them. Learning over time. Just like the only thing their cards are doing is stopping you from doing your thing. And I think my favorite control effects are actually like core game on board control, not just the only thing this does in hand is stops your opponent from doing the thing they're trying to do. I really like, and Ashes does a phenomenal job at a lot of this. Like Ashes Reborn hits almost all of these on the head in terms of the right way to implement them. But, you could have a thing that just says destroy a unit. Straight up. Like your opponent plays a thing, you just destroy it. You could also have a unit on the table that could attack that thing or block that thing and destroy it through damage. So I prefer control through gameplay generally. But there is a little bit of spice in terms of just like, nothing's ever for sure or just totally safe.
Yeah, I think what you're effectively saying there is those heavy denial control effects should be broadcast before they're just suddenly happening. Something has to happen, and then you as the other player knows, okay, so they could cancel the next thing that I do. How am I going to play into that?
Sure.
And I would say just straight up cancel 1-for-1 out of hand or randomly or in an unknown way is just strictly wrong. I just don't know where, even just the mathematical reality of I trade one of my cards for one of your cards, nothing happens. You feel bad. I don't really do anything that advances my game plan. That's not exactly fun, I think, and just generally. But what you can do, and I really like, there's a reason we play so much Flesh and Blood. I really like how Flesh and Blood does this with Frostbites. So this is really a mechanic that's saying, I'm going to make it harder for you to do what you want to do, but you can still do it. It's just going to cost you more.
Yeah.
And so I would even make the case for any of these hardcore cancel, prevention, kind of prison style mechanics to lean on offering your opponent an out on the cancellation itself. So for instance, a card might say cancel a spell your opponent just played unless they destroy a unit they control.
Yeah.
Or unless they pay 2 additional resources. I think those kinds of things where you introduce a new interaction point where the players can now figure out what the best course is.
Yeah, for sure.
Much better than just shutting the door and saying, okay, I had the card.
And I do think the on table reality of these things too is really good. We had an Ashes game this week where I was playing that Hope pre-made, and one of the cards stacks up to 4 tokens restriction.
Beautiful.
And then I can also take an action to destroy the card to do 4 damage to something.
Yeah.
That's a control effect, right? Most units in the game have 4 or less health. So if I have 4 tokens on it and I blow it up, I could kill pretty much any unit in the game. It hits the table with 0 tokens. You know it's there.
Yeah.
You see how many tokens are on it. You can play. You can make decisions. And it's a perfect example of how Ashes is killing it. You can see it. It's a control effect, and a denial effect. I can remove any unit from the board, but you can bait me with a different unit that you would rather me destroy. You can play around it by canceling damage. Right, there are cards that cancel damage, and that's an anti-control. Cancel damage, right?
Yeah.
But I love the cancels that are just allowing me to do what I do. That's a pocket of control, right? Stopping my opponent from doing whatever they're doing. That feels way better because it's you maintaining what you're trying to do, not you just stopping me from doing what I'm trying to do.
And it just strictly increases interaction. Like the moment I see that on the board, I have to, as a player, adjust my game plan. And now we're playing a new facet of the same game where we're now balancing around the fulcrum point that is this removal mechanic on the board. I think anytime you're designing a denial effect, you should ask yourself, is this going to increase the interaction between the players or not?
And the tension.
Yeah.
And the decision, like I have to decide now when to use it, and you decide what you're playing and when you're playing it to get me to use it and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
I hit the table yesterday and it changed the dynamic of that turn.
Yeah.
And that's a good control effect, right? Those are my favorite.
Yeah, I agree. Resource cards. I'll kick this one off. I still just think it's strictly wrong. I don't know of any reasonable, tangible benefit that you could make an argument for why the variance of the mechanism you need to play the game at all is where the variance in any game should lie.
Yeah, I think I agree. I mean, I don't think we're gonna argue on this one for a while. I do think the best use of resource cards that I've seen is sorcery.
Separate deck.
It's a totally separate deck. You start with a certain number in hand. You can always draw that instead.
Yeah.
You can also use your avatar to get more of that. So it's a choice to have, and those resources look bomb.
They look so
good.
good.
Look so good. But generally, like the RNG of resources in deck, even cards that generate resources in deck, like I'm less, Netrunner is Netrunner. You gotta, all hail the queen. But even in that game, like cards that you draw, the only thing you do is make you more money. It's like cards that make you money off of doing other things in that game. I like, if I successfully do this kind of a run and my opponent can see that and they can see that, there's tension and things being created there.
Yeah.
But just picturing like hedge fund, it's kind of boring. There's 3 of in every deck.
Yeah, you could remove, if you removed all of those just strictly economy cards and the basic economics of the game was click for 1 credit, and click to draw a card, I don't think it's worse.
Yeah.
It may just be better.
I think in Netrunner, there may be some upside to your opponent can't know exactly how much money you have.
Or can make. Yeah, that's true.
Or can make.
That again is like you're talking about, that's creating extra tension.
Yeah.
Can they suddenly get to 20 credits and make this run?
Yeah.
If you know they can't, then the tension goes away.
Yeah. So
there's a reason.
There's a reason.
Garfield knows what he's doing,
that's
right?
there. But I do think, I don't remember which designer said it. And borrowing from Stand on the Shoulders of Giants here, all the interviews were fantastic. Also, I meant to say that earlier in the episode, and we'll get to that in the conclusion. But the understanding that tension point and where it comes from, but I also think cards that are just resources, and especially cards that are just a resource, Pokemon energy cards, Magic Land, are just so uninteresting to me. Even in sorcery, right? Those land they're a separate deck, and they usually have an ability.
Yeah.
So choosing which land to play and where you're playing it, because it's positional.
Yeah.
There's choices and there's tension being created from those as resource cards. So I think there are ways to do resource cards well, but I don't think Magic or Pokemon, the 2 classics, are it at all.
Yeah.
Like it's not even approaching it for me.
But it's what people know, man.
Yeah. I mean, there's an appeal to the nostalgia of that whole system.
There is. There totally is. And it has, it has served those games exceedingly well. Or rather, those games have done exceedingly well. I'm not sure that mechanic is why. Yeah. Silver bullets. Speaking of, we just talked about tension. We just talked about interaction. I think the definition of a silver bullet is a card that doesn't create any tension. It doesn't add to any tension. It just leads to disappointment. If you're playing the thing that's directly countered by the thing, well, I can't do my thing anymore. And if you're playing the thing that directly counters the thing, you don't have fun. I mean, it's just like, okay, I turned that spigot off, but it's not like I'm cooler now or my deck's functioning better now.
Yeah, I mean, the very definition itself, it means it's not good. Yeah. Like, it removes the tension because it just answers the thing. It being a unit that's tough to deal with, or, you know, it possibly, like, I'm just picturing all the examples of, like, Iron Rhino and Ashes.
Yeah. Or being good against a strategy. Yeah. Like, you can have cards that are good against particular things.
But as long as it's actually playing into the core of the game and the core of how it's supposed to work, that's fine, right? Yeah, the ability to do 8 damage to a big unit off of a card is really good, maybe in a game, in your movie unit or whatever it is. But having a card that's just like, you know, if your opponent has a Hobbit out wearing the ring, you win the game. Or like you kill something. It's like, what?
I was thinking of Star Wars CCG. It's like if Lando is in a spaceport, remove Lando and your opponent loses 5 life. Yeah, it's like
if Vader is at the same location as Luke, and you know, and in that game though, interestingly,
they theme it up. I mean,
it's theme, right? And they have cards that make you want to get Luke and Vader in the same spot, and they have cards that are benefits or negatives for doing that.
But they also have cards that just say cancel any one of these cards.
That's the
Nebrin leads and all that.
That's a true silver bullet, right? It's like there was a problem card, so we're going to give you a card that just cancels a card.
Yeah.
That seems not... I think you can achieve a similar by in-game decision-making where, well, whatever the effect of that card is, having a reaction or something you can do that makes that not as good for your opponent to do anymore.
Yeah, when your opponent moves X number of times, deal X damage based on the number of locations.
Totally.
That kind of thing. You
know? There's so many ways to address it that aren't just, hey, this cancels this thing.
We need those bronze bullets. Yeah, effectively. And then finally, limit 1. What do you think? Did you? I mean, MJ made some good points on the limit 1 conversation. Of course, cooperative and board games different than competitive 1v1. But I would say I don't think any designer expressly countered the reality that they're adding a lot of variance and should never be used as a balancing mechanic.
Yeah. I mean, I think the thing from MJ that stuck with me was, you know, rarely is it, oh, this card's really good, let's make sure people only get one of them.
Yeah.
Like that's not the thinking as much as it's like, you know, if 2 or 3 of these get played in a game, maybe that's not so good. Or if you're always seeing this, maybe that's not so good.
Or thematically, there's only one in the world.
Yep. Or thematically, like, you know, sometimes, you know, Tony Zeros was at the bar and he forgot his guns. And this issue popped up and he went on this adventure. He didn't have his guns with him. Like, you can tell a story with that. But I think, especially in any competitive game, balancing something by how often you're seeing it is just bad.
Isn't that interesting? So you think about Flesh and Blood with the legendary mechanic, you have one in the deck, right? One Heart of Find All, these fabled things. That feels very much like a thematic component to me. Like, I don't even think, and again, this is the problem though, is like, I don't even think I would run 3 of any of those cards, you know, like tomes and stuff. But that doesn't necessarily mean that's not the case forever. So it's also, you know, limit 1 there is like, okay, it's a thematic thing, but it could eventually have become a balanced thing too.
Yeah. Well, I think in those cases, it's thematic / collectability. So if you're going to have a collectible game with something really rare, making it where you only ever need one of it is like a really convenient way to make it not like, oh, you have to pay $6,000 to play this deck. Yeah. But I also think in that particular case, they did well to design cards that aren't oppressively powerful. Like, it's clear it wasn't like, this is too good, we can only let you have one of it.
Yeah.
It's like, this is a generally useful effect that you'll be happy to see. And
sometimes not, because it doesn't block.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah. There's a downside. But none of the effects are actually so inherently obviously good. Like, to me, it would be like if they printed Sonata, which is a common card we'll reference, and they're like, oh, you can only have one in your deck.
Yeah, because it's too good with that chess piece.
The skeleton and all this stuff. And it's like, well, yeah, I mean, if you draw that at the right time with the right situation, you just win. But otherwise, just in the deck, cruising around, right? And even that one, though, is like, the less specifically playable something is. A lot of times the busted stuff is like in this very particular scenario. But yeah, I mean, I don't know. Limit 1 is fine-ish.
Theme only. I'll be willing to say that. I'll draw a line in the sand. Only for theme. and make sure it's not stronger than other cards.
Yeah, and the biggest sin of that game or that example is Conquest, right? Which is when you had a limit 1 card that everyone has to play, and it creates a scenario where whoever sees it first probably has a strict advantage.
Yeah, see, because that was theme.
Yeah.
Right? Like that was the thematic element of these heroes get access only to their special stuff. But it kind of gets to where the way Marvel Champions does it is like, just have them start with it.
Yeah.
Like if it's really critical to their game plan, don't have them collect what makes them awesome over the course of the game. Start them out awesome, fully realized, and then let them go fight a battle.
Yeah, and I think a game like Ashes could get away with limit 1 of way better too, because they have the first 5. Pick your opening hand. So if you have a really powerful card, it's not random. It's just that you're only ever going to see this once.
Yeah, if you pull it on the first 5, this is the only time it exists in the game. Till recursion comes in, of course.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, so even that's the thing is the Conquest is a good example because even when theme is the reason you're doing it, you're still now putting a way higher value on these cards, and so they become overly good, and the variant swing gets higher and higher. So thematic is cool, but still stick to the fundies. Don't make things just crazy powerful because now you're in the thematic space of, well, there's only one of these. It's got to be strong, right?
Yeah.
All right, well, that's it. Power 7. We're in and out. Zach,
we did
it. Been a long journey. I hope everybody out there listening has enjoyed it. We've got more things to come on this front and just kind of exploring what we can do with this podcast. So we would love to hear from all of you as to how you found it. Did you like the Power 7 series? You want us to keep going in these kinds of directions? How did you, what was your favorite part of the series? Those kinds of things. We're on YouTube, at least for this series, so you can leave comments, I guess, here in YouTube.
If you're listening to it there.
Or on our Discord is really the preference. Anywhere is fine. General chat. We really need to make that channel for the podcast.
Like a podcast discussion channel.
Yeah, I'll probably do that.
Yeah, that's smart.
Before this releases.
Major shout out to all the designers that came on the show. It was really great getting to talk to them. Total privilege to have that opportunity to really break it all down. And for everyone that made it all the way through all 7 episodes, this was a fun journey, and I'm sure we'll revisit it from time to time as life goes on, things evolve in the industry. This will be a fun one to listen back to in several years from now.
And there will always be new ways to ruin games, I assure you.
Always.
Until next time, everybody, keep playing.